Justice had never been a fair fight. Naomi Carter had learned that lesson long before she ever set foot in a courtroom. Outside her office window, the city stirred to life, its rhythm steady and predictable, the distant honking of impatient drivers, the chatter of pedestrians weaving through sidewalks, the quiet hum of a world that had long since accepted its own injustices. But inside these walls, within the quiet solitude of her chambers, Naomi felt the weight of what was coming. Today was not just another trial. Today was something more. And she knew, without question, that she would be walking into that courtroom alone. Her gaze settled on the black judicial robe hanging neatly in the corner. It was a symbol of authority, a testament to the years of struggle and discipline that had brought her here. But today it felt heavier than usual, as though it carried the weight of every battle she had fought, of every whispered doubt she had ignored, of every quiet resistance that had come before her. She exhaled slowly, bracing herself against the flood of emotions creeping in. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the present, the past always had a way of pulling her back. She was 8 years old again, standing on a cold sidewalk, her small hands gripping the hem of her mother's coat. The night air bit at her skin, but the chill wasn't what made her shiver. It was the fear, the kind that settled deep in her bones, the kind that stole her breath and left her paralyzed. Her father stood beside his car, his hands raised, his voice calm even as the officers circled him. "I haven't done anything wrong," he had said. "Please, just—" The words were cut short by the sickening sound of a fist meeting flesh. Her father staggered, his body jerking from the force of the blow, but he didn't cry out. He didn't resist. He only lifted his head, his eyes filled not with anger, but with something far worse. Resignation. Even as a child, Naomi understood. He knew there was nothing he could do. She wanted to run to him, to scream, to demand that someone, anyone, make it stop. But all she could do was stand there, small and helpless, as the world made its judgment without a second thought. That night, after her father had been released, she had turned to her mother, her voice barely more than a whisper. Why did they do that? Her mother had only pulled her close, her voice quiet, filled with a sorrow Naomi would only later come to understand. Because they don't want us to stand on equal ground. Naomi opened her eyes. The past had a way of creeping in at the worst moments, but she refused to let it consume her. That helpless little girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had fought to make her way into a system that had never been designed for her. A woman who, despite everything, had refused to step aside. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of her robe once more, but this time she did not feel its weight as a burden. She felt it as armor. She straightened her spine and met her own gaze in the mirror across the room. The reflection staring back at her was not just a judge. She was something more. A force. A reckoning. There had been a time when people like her weren't allowed in courtrooms like this. A time when men like Andrew Malone could wield their power unchecked, their actions unchallenged. But today, things would be different. She took a final breath, the weight in her chest no longer fear, but resolve. The words came softly, but with the quiet power of an unshakable vow. I won't let it happen again. The hallway leading to the courtroom was long, lined with towering windows that let in the dull morning light. Naomi walked steadily, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step measured and deliberate. But she could feel it, the weight of their eyes on her, the unspoken judgments hanging in the air like an unrelenting fog. A group of attorneys stood gathered near the entrance, their quiet conversation faltering as she passed. One of them, a tall man with silvering hair, barely concealed the way his lips pressed into a thin line. Another, a woman in a sharp navy suit, leaned toward her colleague and whispered, not quite soft enough for Naomi to miss. She really thinks she can change the system? The words weren't unexpected, but that didn't make them any less cutting. She didn't stop. She didn't falter. She had heard it all before. The murmurs in the hallways, the barely veiled skepticism at bar association events, the pointed stares in courtrooms where she was the only black woman on the bench. They didn't say it outright, but she knew what they were thinking. She doesn't belong here. She gripped the case file in her hand a little tighter. Her phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen. Camille Johnson. Naomi exhaled sharply before answering. "Tell me you're calling with good news," she said, forcing a small breath of humor into her tone. There was a beat of silence before Camille spoke. "I wish I was." Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone. "Malone? He's making this personal." Camille's voice was low, urgent. "It's not just about the case for him. He doesn't just want to win, he wants to humiliate you." Naomi pressed her lips together, her jaw clenching against the familiar burn of frustration. "He can try. I know you're tough, Naomi," Camille continued. "But be careful. He's been in this system a long time. He knows how to twist things, how to make people doubt you before you even open your mouth." Naomi already knew that. She had seen it happen before, how men like Malone, with their unchecked authority and years of quiet, calculated intimidation, turned the rules to fit their own agendas. She slowed as she neared the courtroom doors, taking a steady breath. The weight of her robe still lingered on her shoulders, but she refused to let it drag her down. This wasn't just another case. It wasn't just another day in court. This was a fight for something bigger. She tightened her grip on the file, exhaled once more, and stepped forward. The courtroom was packed to capacity, yet it felt eerily silent. The tension was thick, a weight pressing down on the space, making the very air feel charged. It wasn't just another case. Everyone in the room knew that. This was something more. A battle drawn not in official legal arguments, but in quiet, simmering defiance. On one side of the room, members of the Black community sat shoulder to shoulder, their expressions a mixture of quiet determination and anxious anticipation. Some were here for the defendant, believing in his innocence. Others were here for Naomi Carter, knowing what this case meant, not just for one man, but for an entire system. There were elders, their faces lined with years of witnessing injustice, young activists who carried their defiance like a banner, and families clutching each other as if bracing for a storm. On the opposite side sat rows of uniformed officers, their polished badges gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. They weren't just here to observe, they were here to be seen. A silent, unified show of force. They leaned back in their seats, arms crossed, their expressions blank but unmistakable in their message. "This is our house. This is our system, and you don't belong here." The doors at the back of the room swung open. Naomi stepped in. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible, but she felt it. The stillness tightened, breaths held for just a second too long, bodies tensing as her presence rippled through both sides of the room. Every head turned toward her, every set of eyes following her as she moved forward. She had walked into countless courtrooms before, but today the scrutiny felt different. Sharper. Heavier. It wasn't just her ability as a judge being measured, it was her very right to stand there at all. She didn't pause. She didn't falter. She had learned long ago that hesitation invited doubt, and doubt was something she could never afford. The only sound was the steady click of her heels against the polished floor as she walked toward the bench, her black robe trailing behind her like a shadow. The silence stretched, thick with expectation, until it was finally punctured by a voice from the right side of the room. Low, muttered, but deliberate. She should know her place. It wasn't shouted, but it didn't need to be. It was meant to land, to stain, to remind her that no matter how many times she sat behind that bench, no matter how many cases she presided over, to some, she would always be less than. She didn't react, not outwardly, but she felt it. The way she had felt it in law school, in bar exams, in hushed conversations where her name had been spoken with skepticism. The way she had felt it as a little girl, standing on a cold sidewalk, watching her father take a blow without protest because he knew fighting back meant something worse. She reached the bench, setting down her case file with deliberate control, letting her fingers linger against the wood for just a moment. The room was still watching, waiting to see if she would waver, if she would shrink under the weight of all that was pressing against her. Instead, she lifted her chin and let her gaze sweep across the room. She saw them, the ones who were waiting for her to fail, the ones who were willing her to succeed. She saw Malone, seated at the prosecution's table, his arms folded, a smirk just barely playing at the corner of his mouth. She saw the officers, silent and unmoving, daring her to acknowledge them. And she saw the families, the community, the people who had come not just for a trial, but for something bigger. Let them watch. She took a breath, steady and unshaken, and spoke. "Court is now in session." Her voice rang through the room, clear and firm. The weight in the air didn't lessen. If anything, it grew heavier, but she was ready to carry it. The courtroom remained silent, thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to settle into every inch of the space. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, charged with anticipation. Naomi had just called the court into session, but the real battle was only beginning. She glanced down at the case file in front of her, preparing to proceed, when a voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. "Miss Carter." The words weren't loud, but they carried across the room with precision, each syllable sharpened with intent. A ripple of reaction followed, subtle but unmistakable. A few quiet scoffs from the right side of the room, a barely concealed smirk exchanged between two officers in the back row. One of them shifted slightly in his seat, arms crossing over his chest, as if settling in to watch what he expected to be a spectacle. Naomi didn't look up right away. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly who had spoken. Slowly, she lifted her gaze and met Captain Andrew Malone's eyes. He sat at the prosecution's table, leaning back in his chair with an ease that was almost lazy, one arm draped over the backrest, the other tapping a slow rhythm against the desk. His expression was one of casual amusement, but his eyes gleamed with something sharper, something meant to cut. "My apologies," he continued, the smirk deepening. "Your Honor." He dragged the words just enough to make them feel like a joke, his tone soaked in condescension. The same way a schoolyard bully would offer a forced apology, all while daring his target to react. A younger version of herself might have felt the burn of humiliation creep up her neck, might have responded too quickly, too sharply, might have let him win. But Naomi had long since learned the power of silence, so she let it stretch. She didn't flinch, she didn't move. Instead, she allowed the quiet to settle back over the room, forcing everyone to feel it. She watched as Malone's smirk twitched, just slightly, when the reaction he had anticipated didn't come. And then, just when the silence had weighed enough to shift the energy in the room, he exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if the entire situation were absurd. "Justice," he mused, the word rolling off his tongue like a bitter joke. "Are we really talking about justice here?" His gaze flicked toward the bench, then back to her, letting the insult sink in, before delivering the final blow. "A person like you," he continued, voice slow, measured, "sitting in that chair." The words landed with a dull, suffocating weight, pressing into the room like a slow-building storm. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Even the officers who had chuckled earlier remained still, their amusement tempered by the sheer audacity of what had just been said. Naomi felt her fingers tighten against the bench. Not enough for anyone to see, just enough for her to feel it. She had spent her life in rooms like these, rooms where people like Malone believed power belonged to them, where they measured worth by the color of skin and the weight of privilege. She had walked into those rooms before, and she had never walked out smaller than when she entered. With careful precision, she released her grip, exhaling a breath so controlled it barely stirred the air in front of her. Then she leaned forward, just slightly, and locked eyes with Malone. "Are you finished, Captain Malone?" Her voice was steady, unshaken, not cold, not sharp, just calm even. A blade not raised in anger but sharpened in restraint. There was a flicker of something in his expression, annoyance maybe, just a hint of frustration that his attempt to provoke her had not gone the way he expected. She let him feel it. Then, with quiet finality, she looked away, turning her attention to the file before her, dismissing him as though he were nothing more than a momentary interruption. Proceed. The balance in the room shifted. The power he had tried to take from her had been given back, without her ever having to raise her voice. The tension in the courtroom thickened, coiling around the space like an invisible force. The weight of unspoken truths, of long-buried resentments, pressed down on the air between them. Naomi had just dismissed him, brushed him aside with nothing more than a measured response and a shift of her gaze. That should have been the end of it. But Malone wasn't the kind of man who took well to being ignored. His smirk faded, the amusement draining from his face as he straightened in his chair. The casual arrogance that had draped over him like a second skin was gone, replaced by something colder. Sharper, he stepped forward. It was a small movement, just one step, but in the charged silence of the courtroom, it felt like a declaration. When he spoke again, his voice was lower now, quieter, but there was no mistaking the threat woven beneath it. "You think you can change this system?" His words curled through the space between them, deliberate, measured. "People like me built this system. People like you were never meant to be part of it." A slow murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was subtle at first, a shift of bodies, a rustle of fabric as people exchanged uneasy glances. The words had landed like a fist to the gut, the kind of statement that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be misinterpreted. Naomi didn't move, didn't blink. She had seen this tactic before. She had lived it. Men like Malone thrived on intimidation, on the unspoken belief that if they pushed hard enough, leaned in close enough, they could make people forget their place, make them question whether they belonged at all. She let the silence stretch between them, just long enough to make him feel the weight of his own words. Then slowly, she rose from her seat. She didn't have to step forward. She didn't have to meet him halfway. The space between them had never belonged to him. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, quieter than his, but it cut through the room like a blade, each syllable slicing through the tension with precision. "I don't need your approval, Captain Malone," she said, her tone calm, steady, unshaken. "And I don't need you to recognize my place in this courtroom." She let the words settle, let them sink into the fabric of the room. "But let me remind you, justice has never been, and will never be, the privilege of a chosen few." The murmurs grew louder now, a ripple that spread outward from the center of the room. On one side of the courtroom, members of the community nodded, their eyes locked onto Naomi, their quiet expressions shifting into something stronger, something close to hope. On the other side, among the sea of uniformed officers, there was movement. Some of them remained rigid, their jaws clenched, their postures stiff with quiet solidarity behind Malone. But others shifted, exchanging uncertain glances, their discomfort evident. Not everyone in that room was willing to co-sign his words. And that, Naomi knew, was where his power would start to fracture. She didn't look away from him. She didn't need to. Because for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, Malone hesitated, just for a second, and she made sure he felt it. The room was suffocating under the weight of what had just been revealed. The neatly constructed walls of silence that had protected men like Andrew Malone for years were beginning to crack, and there was no stopping it now. Camille Johnson stood tall, her presence commanding but unhurried. She didn't need theatrics. The truth was damning enough. "Your Honor," she said, placing a thick stack of documents on the table in front of her. "I submit into evidence official records detailing a pattern of misconduct by Captain Andrew Malone, records that were intentionally withheld from this court." She didn't rush. One by one, she slid each file forward, letting the weight of the moment settle. These documents contained sworn complaints of excessive force, falsified reports, and racially motivated profiling, all swept under the rug, buried deep where no one was supposed to find them. A dull thud echoed each time she placed another file down. The sound landed like a hammer against stone, chipping away at the carefully built illusion of untouchability that Malone had spent his entire career cultivating. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, rising in intensity as the implications took hold. A man in the gallery let out a sharp, bitter laugh. So it was true all along. From the back, another voice, raw with anger. "He needs to be held accountable." Naomi tapped her gavel lightly, not to suppress the outrage, but to steady the room before it became uncontrollable. But the shift was undeniable. People were no longer afraid to speak. The silence, the thing that had protected Malone for so long, had shattered. Across the room, Malone sat stiff in his chair, his fingers clenched so tightly against the table that his knuckles had turned white. He hadn't moved, but Naomi could see the change in him. The way his jaw tensed, the way his breathing had grown shallower. For the first time, he felt what it was like to be exposed. Then he moved. Slowly at first, pushing himself up from his seat. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor sent a jagged note through the tense silence. When he spoke, his voice was sharp, laced with something just short of panic. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Carter?" He turned to face Naomi now. his composure beginning to crack. "You call this justice? This isn't a trial. This is a goddamn witch hunt." No one in the room so much as flinched. He was losing them. Naomi leaned forward just slightly, resting her hands against the bench, her gaze never leaving his. "This isn't a witch hunt, Captain Malone," she said, voice steady, even. "This is accountability." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, but there was no amusement behind it. He looked around the room, seeking out support from his fellow officers. For years, they had always been there, standing beside him, behind him, ensuring that men like him never had to answer for what they did. But now some of them wouldn't even meet his gaze. And then, from the row of uniformed officers, a single voice cut through the silence. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Enough, Andrew." The words came from a young officer seated in the second row, his uniform still crisp, his hands curled into tight fists against his knees. His voice wasn't angry, just tired, resolute. Malone's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. "You don't know what the hell you're talking about, kid," he hissed. "You think you can stand there and—" "No," the officer interrupted, his voice firmer this time. He exhaled sharply, then stood, straightening his shoulders. "I know exactly what I'm saying." The room stilled again. The shift wasn't just in the words, it was in the moment, in the way the young officer squared his stance, the way his fingers trembled slightly before steadying. For years, Malone had relied on the silence of men like him. But now, even that was crumbling. "We took an oath," the young officer continued, his gaze unwavering, "to serve and protect, not to silence and destroy." Malone opened his mouth, but nothing came. For the first time, he had no words. The weight of it, the sheer finality of his fall, was settling into his skin, pressing against his bones. This wasn't just Naomi Carter standing against him. This wasn't just Camille Johnson exposing him. This was the system, the very thing he had used as a weapon, turning on him. And as he stood there, alone in the middle of the courtroom, surrounded by the echoes of his own unraveling, he finally understood. The ground beneath him had already given way, and there was nothing left to hold on to. The jury filed out in silence, their footsteps echoing through the courtroom like distant drum beats. The room remained still, as if the very air was bracing for what came next. Naomi watched them go, her expression unreadable, though she could feel the weight of every eye on her. The tension in the space was thick, suffocating, stretched so tightly that it felt as though even the smallest movement might snap it apart. Malone had not sat back down. He stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw locked so tightly that Naomi could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. For years, he had been the one in control, the man who dictated the rules, bent them when necessary, shattered them when it suited him, and now in this moment, he had no control at all. Naomi didn't rush. She let the silence settle over him, let him feel it, the absence of power, the absence of certainty. Then she spoke. "Captain Andrew Malone," she said, her voice measured, firm, unshaken. "Effective immediately, you are placed under formal investigation for multiple counts of misconduct, falsification of records, and excessive use of force." The words cut through the room, final and absolute. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Some faces lit with vindication, others with quiet disbelief. Even among the officers there was a shift. Some remained rigid, but others averted their eyes, the first signs of distance, of retreat. And Malone? For the first time he looked small. The smirk was gone. The arrogance had drained from his face, leaving behind something hollow. He stood there, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his mind racing for a way out. But there was no way out. The walls had closed in, the floor had given way beneath him, and the world was watching. Somewhere in the back of the room, a single clap echoed. Then another, and another. A swell of quiet triumph rolled through the crowd. Not loud, not celebratory, but something deeper. A release. A reckoning. Malone barely heard it. He turned, his movements stiff, his face pale beneath the harsh courtroom lights. He had to get out. The moment he stepped through the courthouse doors, the world erupted. The press had been waiting. Microphones were shoved toward his face, cameras flashing like bursts of lightning, voices overlapping, demanding answers he didn't have. "Captain Malone, do you have anything to say about the investigation? Did you falsify reports to cover up police misconduct? What do you say to the families of the victims?" He tried to push through, to keep moving, but they were relentless. The wall of reporters, the sea of faces that had once looked at him with admiration, now only saw a man undone, a man exposed, a man who had spent years wielding power without consequence, now drowning beneath the weight of accountability. And no one was coming to save him. The quiet inside Naomi's chambers was a stark contrast to the storm that had just unfolded outside. The echoes of the trial still lingered, the murmurs of the crowd, the sharp claps of the gavel, the rising tide of voices demanding justice. But here in this space, the weight of it all settled differently. Camille leaned against the edge of Naomi's desk, arms crossed, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. She had spent years in courtrooms, had fought battles that never made the headlines, had seen justice slip through the cracks more times than she cared to admit. And yet, today had been different. She exhaled slowly, glancing at Naomi. "You think he's going to fight this?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. Naomi didn't answer right away. She stood near the window, her fingers resting lightly on the frame as she looked out over the city. The sky had shifted since the morning, the deep gray of uncertainty giving way to streaks of light, warm and slow, stretching across the horizon. She had walked into that courtroom prepared for a war, knowing full well that justice wasn't given freely, that it had to be carved out, piece by piece, against a system that had never been built to serve people like her. But today, something had changed. Malone could fight. He could deny, he could stall, he could throw every last ounce of his influence into the machine and try to grind it all to a halt. It didn't matter, because today, he wasn't the one writing the rules anymore. Naomi turned back to Camille, a quiet certainty in her gaze. "He can do whatever he wants," she said simply. She let her eyes drift back to the horizon, where the first rays of morning stretched higher, brighter. But from today forward, this system will no longer belong to men like him. Naomi had just stepped out of her chambers when she saw him, a man in his late 70s, his frame slightly bent with age, but his presence unwavering. His dark brown skin was weathered, lined with the kind of years that had seen too much, endured too much, fought too much. But in his eyes, there was something else, something quiet yet powerful: respect. He stood there, waiting, hands clasped in front of him, as though he had been standing in that very spot for years, waiting for this moment. Naomi paused, giving him her full attention. The corners of his lips lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. He nodded, his voice low but steady. "You didn't just win today, Judge Carter," he said. "You set a precedent." The word settled deep in her chest, heavier than she expected. Precedent. She had spent her entire career hearing that word, used as a shield, a justification, a roadblock, an excuse. We follow precedent. This is how it's always been done. The system doesn't change overnight, but today those words carried a different weight, because for the first time, the precedent was hers. For the first time, someone like her, standing where she stood, had reshaped the landscape of justice, had forced the system to acknowledge what it had spent so long pretending wasn't there. She met his gaze, holding it for a beat before finally nodding. "Let's hope it holds," she said. The man gave her a knowing look, one that carried decades of understanding. "It will," he assured her. "Because now they know we're watching." A long pause. Then with another nod, he stepped back into the crowd, disappearing into the sea of people waiting beyond the courthouse steps. Naomi inhaled deeply before finally stepping outside. The moment she did, the world around her came alive. The crowd had grown since the trial ended. Families, activists, reporters, strangers who had only read about the case but had felt its weight all the same. Some faces she recognized. Most she didn't. But they were all there, standing together in a way that was undeniable. For so many years, she had walked into courtrooms alone, fought alone, endured alone. But today, as she descended the courthouse steps, moving into the current of people who had gathered in the name of justice, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't alone anymore. Justice isn't just about one case. It's about every voice that refuses to be silenced. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the power of standing up for what's right, we invite you to take action. Hit the like button, share this story with others, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives that shine a light on truth and justice. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our passion to keep creating content that matters. Together, we can keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching.